The rent was due in 11 days. The Vreth had taken everything else. Joel Wren found out he no longer had a job the same morning. The Vreth docked their harvest ships over 17 coastal cities and began what their communications officers, politely, almost bureaucratically, called a resource optimization event. The severance notice came through his work pad at 6:04 a.m. His alarm had gone off at 6:00. He had not yet made coffee. The notification was brief and bloodless. His engineering contract with the Interplanetary Logistics Consortium had been terminated effective immediately, as ILC was restructuring its technical workforce in light of the new Vreth-aligned automation mandates. He was thanked for his service. He was wished well in his future endeavors. He sat on the edge of his cot in the converted storage bay he rented from a retired harbor pilot named Greta, and he read the message twice. Then he looked at the ceiling, which was low and water-stained, and had a small brown patch in the corner that he had always meant to say something about. He thought about how much the cot had cost him to ship here after the evacuation of Portland. He thought about the 11 months he had spent designing load-bearing joint assemblies for orbital transfer vehicles that the consortium now planned to fill with Vreth-manufactured equivalents at a third of the cost. He thought about the brown patch on the ceiling for a moment longer. Then he got up, pulled on his work jacket, and went into the back storeroom where Max was powered down in standby mode, folded into the space between two shelving units like a very large and very patient person waiting for a bus. Max, Modular Autonomous Exoskeletal Unit, serial designation 7REN04, named with the kind of affection that engineers assign to things they have spent too many nights alone with, was not, by any reasonable military or commercial standard, impressive. He was 1.9 meters tall when standing, constructed from a patchwork of salvaged consortium-grade alloy plating, second-generation haptic feedback musculature, and a cognition core that Joel had hand-coded over 2.5 years of evenings and weekends. He had 2 arms, 2 legs, a sensor cluster that passed for a face if you didn't look too hard, and a pair of optical receptors that glowed a warm, low amber when he was thinking. He had been built to assist with heavy fabrication work, lifting, precision placement, load calculation. He was good at his job. He was, in fact, better at it than anyone Joel had ever worked alongside, and Joel had worked alongside some very good people. Joel pressed his thumb to the activation pad on Max's chest. The amber light came on. Slow at first the way it always did, blinking twice, like someone surfacing from deep water, and then steady. "Good morning, Joel," Max said. His voice was low, unhurried, with a slight resonant quality that had developed over time from the particular way the sound emitter interacted with his chest cavity. Joel had not programmed that. It had simply happened, the way some things happen when you build something carefully and give it enough time. "Morning," Joel said. He sat on an overturned cargo bin across from Max and pressed his hands together between his knees. Outside, somewhere over the harbor, there was the low cyclic drone of a Vreth transit sled moving between the docked harvest ships. It had become ordinary background noise in the 4 months since the optimization had begun. Joel did not look up at the sound, neither did Max. "I got laid off." Max processed this for a moment. "I see. The consortium is switching to Vreth automation components. Cheaper. Fewer maintenance requirements. No benefits package. When is rent due?" Joel almost smiled. Max had learned, over the course of their time together, that the fast path to the thing that actually mattered was usually a direct one. 11 days, Joel said. "I've got enough in reserves for 8. Maybe 9 if I stop eating anything that isn't rice." Max looked at him with those amber optical receptors in the way that had always struck Joel as more considered than a machine should be. Not performing thought, but actually doing it. Somewhere in the layered architecture of the cognition core. "What are the available employment options in this area?" "I've been looking. Engineering posts are gone. The Vreth automated most of the consortium-adjacent work 2 months ago. There's some manual day labor at the harbor, but the Vreth crew supervisors have a quota system, and humans are bottom-tier applicants now." Joel rubbed the back of his neck. "There's a grease trap job at the harbor commissary, a night shift slot unloading cargo at the Vreth interface depot, and apparently the noodle stand on Platform 7 needs someone to run the register for the 4 to midnight shift. 3 jobs, Max said. "Yeah, 3 jobs. And the problem is that 2 of them overlap in the late afternoon window, and even if I took all 3, I physically cannot." "I can do them," Max said. Joel stopped. Max's optical receptors glowed steady amber. "The grease trap maintenance is mechanical work. I can perform it in approximately 40% of the time a human worker would require. The cargo unloading is within my load-bearing specifications. The register terminal at the noodle stand is a standard Harbor Authority interface. I have the relevant commercial transaction protocols in my base code. I can cycle between all 3 jobs within the posted shift windows. Joel looked at him for a long time. Max did not look away, because Max had never been programmed with the reflex of looking away, and after 2.5 years, Joel had come to find it useful rather than unsettling. They're not going to hire a robot, Joel said. The day labor listings don't specify biological applicants, Max said, and the noodle stand listing says reliable and detail-oriented. I am both. The Vrith automated this whole coastline, and you want to go apply for minimum wage jobs. You need to pay rent, Max said. With the same calm he applied to everything, which was sometimes infuriating and sometimes the most grounding thing in Joel's world. This is a solvable problem. Joel was quiet for another moment. Outside, the drone of the transit sled faded. Somewhere in the harbor, a gull was screaming at something. Okay, Joel said. Let's build you a resume. The harbor district of New Cascadia had the particular atmosphere of a place that had been through several kinds of bad luck and had decided, collectively, to keep moving anyway. The original city was 40 meters underwater. The current one had been assembled from salvage platforms, repurposed cargo infrastructure, and the kind of improvised construction that happens when a population needs shelter faster than supply chains can deliver materials. It smelled like salt and machine oil and the particular sharpness of whatever the Vreth harvest ships vented during their offloading cycles, which the Harbor Authority's Environmental Office had officially classified as within acceptable parameters, and which everyone who lived within 2 kilometers of the docks classified as the smell of everything going wrong. The noodle stand on Platform 7 was called Marcy's, after its owner, a woman named Marceline Okafor, who had relocated from what used to be Seattle, and who had, in the intervening years, become the best noodle vendor in a 2-platform radius, which was not a small thing. She had 8 tables, a gas-fed broth kettle that she ran 16 hours a day, and a deep and abiding distrust of anything she hadn't personally tested. She was 61 years old, short, and had the eyes of someone who had spent decades determining whether people were worth her time. She looked Max up and down for approximately 4 seconds when he appeared at the service window with Joel's hand-printed application form. You're a machine, she said. Yes, Max said. Joel Wren sent you. Yes. He apologizes for not coming himself. He's working on a secondary application at the cargo depot. Marce studied the application form. Then she looked at Max again. Then she looked at the application form. It says here you're detail-oriented. I have not made an arithmetic error in 2 years, 4 months, and 17 days, Max said, excluding intentional test cases. The last 3 people I hired for this shift couldn't make change correctly. I can make change correctly. She was quiet for a moment. She reached under the counter and produced a laminated Harbor Authority currency card and a small basket of credit chips in 3 denominations. Give me change for a 60-credit meal from a 200 credit card, 1 chip smaller than 20. Max processed this in 0.3 seconds and produced the correct combination. Marcy looked at the chips. She looked at Max. She put the chips back in the basket. 4 to midnight. Don't be late. Don't touch the broth kettle. And don't tell any of my regulars you're a machine unless they ask, because half of them are going through enough already. Understood, Max said. The grease trap was under Platform 4, accessible through a maintenance hatch that smelled like the bottom of a harbor that had given up on itself. The Harbor Authority's maintenance contractor, a sullen man named Bertrand, who wore a reflective vest at all times, even indoors, as though disaster was always approximately vest-related, had been advertising for a trap technician for 6 weeks with no takers. He looked at Max for a long time. Can you fit through the access hatch? He asked. Max tilted his head 3.7 degrees and calculated. Yes. Can you operate a vacuum extraction line? Yes. Are you going to complain about the smell? I don't have olfactory receptors, Max said. Bertrand wrote something on his clipboard. When can you start? Now if you'd like. Bertrand handed him the vacuum line. Every other morning, 5 a.m. I pay when the trap's clean. No clean, no pay. Understood, Max said and climbed through the hatch. The Vreth interface depot at the north end of the harbor was a different matter. The Vreth did not, as a species, do anything the way humans expected. They were bilateral but not symmetrical. Their left sides were larger and more heavily muscled than their right, in a way that took human eyes several seconds to process correctly. Their skin had a faint iridescence in certain light, and their faces were broad and low, with eyes that faced almost entirely sideways, giving them a nearly 300-degree field of vision. They communicated in a layered system of vocalization and chemical signal. The translation devices they wore for human interactions were good, but not perfect. And they tended to flatten nuance into something that read as either formal or dismissive, depending on your frame of reference. The depot supervisor was a Vreth named something that translated approximately to third in authority of night offloading, though the human workers had shortened this to Theron because human tongues have limits. Theron was large even by Vreth standards, and wore a supervisory sash in a color that translated to something between red and a concept of dominance. He surveyed Max from approximately 6 feet away with his sideways eyes and said nothing for a long time. "You are a fabricated worker," he said. The translation device gave his voice a slightly granular quality, like gravel in a rolling barrel. "Not biological correct," Max said. "Our optimization data indicates fabricated workers are." There was a brief pause while the translation device searched for the correct word, preferred to biological ones. "I am aware," Max said. "I'm applying for the cargo unloading shift." Theron looked at him. The sideways eyes were difficult to read, and Joel had warned Max about this. "Do not try to interpret Vreth facial expression by human metrics because you will be wrong every time. And being wrong about what a Vreth supervisor is feeling is the kind of mistake that tends to compound. The shift is physically demanding," Theron said. "I am rated for loads up to 800 kilograms, Max said. I don't require breaks. I don't make filing errors. And I work the night shift, which I understand has had difficulty retaining human workers. Because it is dark and the smell of the off-floating vents is," the translator searched undesirable. "I don't have olfactory receptors," Max said. Something moved in Theron's expression that Max filed under uncertain, possibly reassessing. The Vreth supervisor looked at his manifest tablet, looked at Max, and made a notation. "You begin tonight. 11 p.m. You will be supervised. You will not touch cargo marked with a yellow stripe. That is designated Vreth-only handling. You will not ask questions about the nature of the cargo." "Understood," Max said. Theron paused. "You said that word already." "It's the correct word," Max said. A very long pause. Then Theron made another notation on his manifest. "Go," he said. The first week was an education. 5 a.m. grease trap under platform 4. Max descended through the hatch, worked the vacuum line through the accumulated fat and particulate with systematic efficiency, logged the readings, and was topside and clean before Bertrand arrived at 6:30. Bertrand would check the trap, say nothing, and hand Max a small stack of credit chips without making eye contact, which Max had come to understand was Bertrand's version of warmth. 4 p.m. Marcy's noodles stand on platform 7. Max worked the register with a precision that Marcy found after the first 3 days deeply unnerving and then deeply reassuring. He remembered every regular's usual order after the first time they ordered it. He learned which customers needed extra time to count their credit chips, and he never showed impatience. He learned which ones were having bad days. There was a pattern in how they held their shoulders, the speed at which they reached for their bowls, and he said nothing beyond what was required, which turned out to be exactly the right amount. A man named Dalton came in every evening at 5:45, ordered the pork bone broth with extra scallion, and always spent 30 seconds more than he needed to at the register. Not because he had trouble with the interface, but because he was lonely, and the transaction was, in some way, contact with another person. Max had figured this out by day 3. By day 5, he had started asking Dalton how his shift at the water treatment facility had gone, and Dalton had started arriving at 5:43. Mars noticed this. She said nothing about it, but she started leaving Max's credit chip payment in a slightly larger stack than their agreement specified. 11 p.m. Vreth Interface Depot. The night cargo work was heavy and monotonous in the way that heavy monotonous work always is, which is to say that it was the kind of thing that wore humans down but which Max performed with perfect, even consistency. He loaded, he stacked, he logged manifests. The other workers on the night shift were mostly older men and women who had taken the shift because the daytime slots were gone, and they watched Max work for the first 2 nights with a wariness that slowly, and without anyone acknowledging it, became something like relief. A woman named Sandra, who had been a structural engineer before the optimization, worked the pallet station beside Max's on the 3rd night. She watched him lift a 500-kilogram freight container with the same mechanical ease he applied to everything, and she said, "You're not even breathing hard." I don't breathe, Max said. Right, she said. She thought about this. Must be nice. It has advantages, Max said, and disadvantages. Sandra looked at him. What's the disadvantage? Max considered this for 1.1 seconds, which was longer than he usually took for factual queries. I notice things, he said. I don't have the option of not noticing them. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to the pallet station. But she started saying good morning to him when he arrived, which none of the other workers had done. Joel spent his days applying for engineering positions that no longer existed, filling out Harbor Authority relief forms, eating rice, and trying not to think too carefully about the scope of what had happened. The Vreth optimization had not been a war. That was the thing that people kept getting tangled in. It didn't map onto the shape of a war, and so some part of the human brain kept waiting for it to become one. There had been no invasion force, no ground troops, no ultimatum followed by explosions. The Vreth had arrived with their harvest ships and their automation systems and their immensely sophisticated economic logic, and they had simply absorbed, sector by sector, industry by industry. The jobs had gone, the production had shifted, and the humans who had built and operated those systems had been optimized out of them in the same bloodless, bureaucratic way that Joel had been optimized out of his position at the consortium. The Vreth were not cruel. Joel had thought about this a lot, in the hours he spent staring at the water-stained ceiling. They were not cruel because cruelty requires caring about the thing you're doing something to. And the Vreth, as best anyone had been able to determine from 4 months of failed diplomatic contact, did not care about humans the way a predator cares about prey, or the way a tyrant cares about subjects. They cared about efficiency. They cared about resources. They experienced humanity the way a river experiences a rock, as an obstacle to flow around, not something worth being angry at. This was in a way worse. On the 5th evening, Joel was sitting at the table in Greta's kitchen, pushing rice around a bowl, when Max came home from the 4 to midnight shift at Marcy's and set 3 stacks of credit chips on the table. Joel looked at the chips. He looked at Max. How's the deposit looking? We will have full rent, plus a 7-day reserve by day 9, Max said. Ahead of schedule, Joel nodded slowly. Outside, the harbor lights were reflecting off the water in long amber lines. Did anything happen today? Max set his sensor cluster toward the window for a moment, the gesture that meant he was organizing something. At the depot, he said, I noticed that the yellow stripe cargo contains biological material. Joel went very still. Max's amber optical receptors held steady. I am not supposed to ask questions about the nature of the cargo, but I notice things. The containers are temperature controlled to a range consistent with biological stasis. The weight-to-volume ratio suggests a material that is dense and irregular, and there is a particular resonance through the freight bay floor when those containers move that does not match the mineral or manufactured materials in the rest of the manifest. Joel's rice had gone cold. He was not thinking about it. How much cargo? 43 containers in the last 4 nights, Max said. Of varying sizes, Joel was quiet for a long time. The harbor outside was dark and ordinary, the lights of the Vreth harvest ships sitting in their designated anchorage zones, like very large, very indifferent stars. You said you weren't supposed to ask questions, Joel said. I am not asking questions, Max said. I am telling you what I noticed. The Harbor Authority's Human Liaison Office was staffed by a man named Prescott, who had the specific exhaustions of someone who had spent 4 months trying to file formal diplomatic complaints with an entity that did not recognize the concept of formal diplomatic complaints. He had a desk that was buried under paper, a coffee that was always either too hot or too cold, and the expression of a person who had accepted that all of his work was unlikely to matter and had decided to do it anyway. Joel sat across from Prescott and put a data chip on the desk. Max's sensor logs from the depot, Joel said. 4 nights worth. Prescott looked at the chip. He looked at Joel. He picked up the chip and plugged it into his reader, and for several minutes he scrolled through the logs with the careful attention of someone who's hoping very hard that the data would say something other than what he suspected it was going to say. It did not say something other than that. Prescott put the reader down. I need to make some calls, he said. Who to? Joel asked. Prescott's mouth pressed into a line. Anyone who's still answering them. The meetings happened fast, which meant they were happening in the way that meetings happen when something has finally crested from possible problem to confirmed crisis. Prescott had contacts, former consortium administrators, Harbor Authority security, a network of human liaison offices across 6 platforms, and they had contacts And within 36 hours, Joel was sitting in a repurposed shipping container that had been converted into a secure briefing room across a folding table from 7 people who had the collective bearing of people who had been awake for too long and were running on the specific fuel of someone who has realized they have no choice. Max stood in the corner. He had been invited specifically because he had the data, and because someone had finally realized that the unit who had been quietly, methodically noticing things for 4 nights at the depot was probably the most reliable witness they had. "Walk us through it again," said a woman named Admiral Harrow, retired technically, but the room had deferred to her immediately, in the way rooms defer to people who have made a career of being correct under pressure. She was 63, compact, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of stillness that comes from having learned to save energy for when it matters. Max walked them through it: the container dimensions, the temperature profiles, the weight-to-volume ratios, the resonance signatures, the shipping schedules that, when overlaid with each other, revealed a pattern of periodic offloading to a Vreth shuttle that departed the harvest ships on a fixed 17-day cycle. 17 days, Harrow said. "Which means the next departure is in 41 hours, Max said. The room was very quiet. "What are they taking?" asked one of the others, a biologist named Dr. Ewan, who had been called in because she understood stasis biology. "I don't know," Max said. "I can tell you the containers are alive. The resonance signature is inconsistent with static organic material. Whatever is in them is in stasis, but the stasis systems are maintaining active thermal regulation, which means something that generates its own heat," Ewan said. Her voice had flat in the way voices go flat when the speaker is suppressing something. Mammalian range. The room was quiet again. Joel had been listening to all of this, with his hands flat on the table. He had been trying, for the last 36 hours, not to let the shape of what this meant fully form in his mind, because the shape was very large and very bad, and it had a specific quality of wrongness that he suspected he was not going to be able to unthink once he let it in completely. He let it in now. He sat with it for a moment. "They're not here for resources," he said. Everyone looked at him. They said they were here for resources. That's what the optimization was, optimization event. Resources. But minerals and manufactured goods don't go into temperature-controlled biological stasis containers. Dr. Ewan's jaw was tight. "No," she said. "They don't. They've been taking people," Joel said. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room full of people who had just heard a thing they had already suspected confirmed out loud, and who were now in the moment before the response. The fraction of a second before the gravity of it becomes the new floor under everyone's feet. Admiral Harrow looked at Max. Max looked back at her with those steady amber optical receptors. "You have 41 hours, Harrow said, and you have access to the depot." "Yes," Max said. "And you have sensor data that tells you exactly which containers, exactly which shuttle bay, and exactly what the offloading sequence looks like." "Yes." Harrow looked around the table. Then she looked back at Max. "What would you need?" Max was quiet for 2.3 seconds, which was, by his processing standards, a long time. He was running 17 simultaneous calculations, access points, security schedules, Vreth patrol patterns he had observed from the depot floor, the weight distribution of the containers, the shuttle's departure window, the geometry of the bay, the 12 most likely failure modes, and their respective countermeasures. "I would need Sandra," Max said. Everyone looked at him. "She's a structural engineer," Max said. "She knows the bay's load infrastructure, and she knows which of the other night shift workers can be trusted." 40 hours later, at 11 p.m., Max went to work as usual. He signed in at the depot entrance. The Vreth supervisor on duty, not Theron tonight, a different one, shorter and less senior, scanned his ID chip and waved him through without looking up. Max went to his station. He began moving cargo. He was reliable and detail-oriented and consistent, which was his entire plan, because the best way to be invisible is to be exactly what you are expected to be. Sandra was 2 stations over. She had brought 3 other night shift workers with her. A broad, quiet man named Oak, who had been a Marine before the optimization, a younger woman named Risa, who had been a systems programmer, and who had spent the last week being carefully furious, and a man named Tom, who was 67 years old and had come when Sandra asked him, simply because Sandra had asked him and he had decided that was enough. They worked, they moved cargo, they were exactly what they were expected to be. At 1:14 a.m., Max moved into position at the yellow stripe container stack as part of his regular manifest route, which he had spent 4 nights carefully adjusting, so that it ended here, at this time, as if it had always ended here. He ran a contact sensor over the nearest container and confirmed the thermal signature, alive. In stasis, but alive. He looked at the Vreth supervisor across the bay, who was reviewing a manifest tablet and not looking at the cargo floor. He looked at Sandra. She looked back and gave him the smallest possible nod. Max attached the emergency release actuator, a tool he had fabricated himself from salvaged depot components over 3 nights. In the hour between the grease trap and the noodle stand in the maintenance shed behind Platform 4 where no one went at 7 a.m., to the container's environmental seal. He had calculated the release sequence from the resonance data. He had run it 11 times in simulation. He ran it now in reality, which is different from simulation in the way that everything real is different from its model. And he was aware of this, and he did it anyway. The container seal hissed. The thermal lock disengaged. The stasis field dropped. From inside the container came the sound of several people breathing. What happened next took 9 minutes and 14 seconds, which is a very short time for the number of things that happened in it. The Vreth supervisor looked up from his manifest. Max stood between the open container and the supervisor, with all 1.9 meters of salvaged alloy and hand-coded cognition drawn to its full height, amber optical receptors steady, and said, "There is an equipment malfunction with container 714. I am running a diagnostic." The supervisor stared at him. "The seal integrity sensor is showing an anomalous reading," Max continued. "Because the best lie, the one that sounds like what you would expect to hear. I will need approximately 4 minutes to isolate the fault. Please advise on protocol." The supervisor, caught between the problem in front of him and the bureaucratic instinct to check the protocol chart, checked the protocol chart. 4 minutes. Sandra had the container's occupants out through the maintenance access corridor in 3. Oak and Riza and Tom had the second container open before the supervisor found the correct protocol page. The maintenance corridor connected to a service shaft that connected to the Harbor Authority's water reclamation network, which Joel had spent 36 hours mapping from old infrastructure schematics, and which Prescott had confirmed was still unmonitored by Vreth scanning systems. Because the Vreth had optimized their monitoring toward the cargo areas and had not considered that the humans who built the platform's infrastructure had built ways through it that didn't appear on any official manifest. This was the thing about humans Max had come to understand. Not from data, but from 4 nights of watching Sandra work her pallet station with the focused competence of someone doing something beneath their capability, and Dalton counting out credit chips at the noodle stand at 5:43 because a transaction was a form of contact, and Bertrand handing over credit chips without eye contact as a form of warmth, and Joel sitting in a converted storage bay, staring at a water-stained ceiling and deciding to get up. Humans did not optimize. They accumulated. They built redundant systems because they forgot about the original ones. They maintained connections to old things because leaving them behind felt wrong. They created pathways through their own infrastructure that no external model would predict. Because the pathways were not for efficiency but for the same stubborn, unquantifiable reason that people hum songs their mothers taught them when wiring something in the dark. The Vreth had modeled human infrastructure very well. They had not modeled humans. The Vreth supervisor found the correct protocol page and looked up. Max was still standing in front of container 714. The container was empty behind him, though the supervisor could not see this from his angle. Max had calculated the angle. "The fault appears to be in the secondary seal actuator," Max said. "I would recommend flagging this for maintenance inspection before the shuttle departure window." The supervisor stared at him for a long moment. The sideways eyes moved across Max's frame in the way Vreth eyes moved when they were assessing something. Not the thing they were looking at, but the thing behind the thing they were looking at. "You are the fabricated worker," the supervisor said. "Yes," Max said. "You have been working this shift for 11 days, correct?" "You are efficient," the supervisor said. It sounded like an observation the way it did when Vreth said things that were somewhere between fact and judgment. "Our optimization models rated fabricated workers at 340% the productivity of biological workers on standardized cargo tasks." "I'm aware of the models," Max said. The supervisor looked at him. "You do not object to the models." "I don't make errors in the models," Max said. "But the models are about cargo tasks." The Vreth supervisor was very still for a moment. Then he said slowly, "What does that mean?" Max let the amber optical receptors hold steady. "It means," he said, That I'm very good at the things I was built for. And the things I was built for are not all in the productivity models. The supervisor stared at him for a long, long moment. The sideways eyes were unreadable by human standards. And Max was not trying to read them by human standards. He was reading them by the standard of 11 days of observation. And what he saw was something he would have described, if pressed, as the first moment a system encounters a variable it did not know to model. Then, Theron came through the depot entrance, which was not what Max had predicted. His calculations had placed Theron off shift. He had been wrong, which was the gap between simulation and reality, and he had always known the gap was there. Theron stopped when he saw Max standing in front of the open container. His eyes moved. His broad face shifted in a way that was harder to read than the junior supervisor's, but not impossible. Not for someone who had spent 11 nights watching. The biological material is gone, Theron said, not a question. Yes, Max said. The depot was very quiet. The remaining workers had cleared. The maintenance corridor hatch was sealed. Whatever was going to happen now was going to happen here, in 11 seconds or 11 minutes. And Max was the only thing standing in the middle of it. You have been working here for 11 nights, Theron said. You were rated as efficient, reliable, preferable to biological workers. By your models, yes, Max said. And in those 11 nights, Theron continued, you were doing this. I was working the cargo manifest, Max said, and noticing things. I'm very good at noticing things. Theron looked at him. The supervisory sash in its almost red color caught the depot's industrial lighting. What do you want? He said. The translation device flattened it. But somewhere under the flattening there was something that might have been a genuine question. Max considered the question for 1.8 seconds. The same thing I've always wanted, Max said. To do my job, to pay the rent, to keep the people I was built with in one piece. Theron was still. You are a fabricated worker, he said again. You have no people. I beg your pardon, Max said, and his voice had the low, resonant quality it always had. The quality that Joel hadn't programmed, that had simply developed. But that is the thing your models got most wrong. The consequence of that night unspooled over months, the way consequences always do. Not cleanly, not in a satisfying arc, but in the jagged, incremental way that things actually change. The Harbor Authority's evidence, combined with Max's 11 nights of sensor logs, reached the remaining human diplomatic channels, and from there to the Vreth governing consensus, which was a distributed decision-making architecture that processed information slowly, and then moved with the decisive weight of something very large that has been building momentum. The Vreth, it turned out, had not been acting under unified directive. The Harvest Ship cluster at New Cascadia was operating under a regional optimization mandate that had exceeded its authorized parameters. In Vreth bureaucratic terms, this was a significant violation. In human terms, it was the moment when the thing you've been fighting finally has a face you can point at. The 43 containers worth of people, mostly from the flooded coastal zones, the ones who had fallen off the Harbor Authority's population registers in the chaos of the evacuations, were recovered from the shuttle bay in a joint operation that Prescott organized with the particular exhausted competence of someone who has been waiting to do something useful for 4 months. Most were disoriented, all were alive. Yoon spent 3 days barely sleeping, and reported that whoever had designed the Vreth stasis systems had, at minimum, understood how to keep a human body functional, which was not comfort exactly, but was better than the alternative. Joel got a call from the consortium's regional manager on day 46 after the depot incident. The regional manager expressed that the consortium was actively reviewing its restructuring decisions in light of the evolving regulatory environment and wanted to discuss Joel's potential re-engagement. Joel listened to the whole message. Then he called Prescott and asked for his formal testimony transcripts to be included in the Harbor Authority's submission to the Vreth governing consensus. Then he went and found Max, who was in the back storeroom between the shelving units, powered down in standby mode, amber light blinking in its slow 2-beat pulse. Joel pressed the activation pad. Good morning, Max said. Morning, Joel said. He sat on the overturned cargo bin. Outside, the harbor was doing the thing it always did. The gull somewhere screaming at something. The water making its patient sounds. Consortium called. They want me back. Will you go? Max asked. Joel thought about it. He thought about the 11 months of load-bearing joint assemblies. He thought about the severance notice at 6:04 a.m. He thought about Bertrand handing over credit chips without eye contact, and Mars leaving a larger stack than agreed, and Dalton arriving at 5:43, because contact was a form of sustenance, and Sandra working her pallet station with the focused competence of someone operating below their ceiling. No, he said. I've got a different idea. Max's amber receptors held steady. Tell me. The Harbor Authority needs an engineering team, Joel said. Not consortium style, something smaller, independent. People who know the platform infrastructure. Who know where the unofficial pathways are. He paused. Who notice things? Max considered this. You would need funding. I've been talking to Prescott, Joel said, and Harrow. And there's apparently a Vreth governance office that owes us something, which is a sentence I didn't expect to be saying. But here we are. Here we are, Max agreed. Joel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you know the thing I keep thinking about. You went to apply for those jobs. 3 minimum wage jobs at the worst possible moment in the worst possible market. And you just did it. Because there was a problem and it was solvable. It was your idea, Max said. You said it was a solvable problem, Joel said. It was. Joel almost smiled, the same almost that had been there on the first morning, the one that hadn't quite made it all the way. 11 days, he said. 9 in the end, Max said. We came in ahead of schedule. Outside, the harbor made its patient sounds. The gull had settled. The Vreth harvest ships sat in their anchorage zones, and somewhere in the Vreth governing consensus, the slow weight of consequence was moving. The water-stained ceiling in the converted storage bay had a brown patch in the corner that Joel had always meant to say something about. He was going to say something about it now. It turned out the landlord had been meaning to fix it too, was grateful even, that someone had finally asked. It was, in the end, the kind of thing that only needed noticing. Max's amber light held steady in the dim room, warm and low and unhurried the way it always did when he was thinking, which was, as it happened, most of the time.